Any man who's honest with himself wants to be dominant. Dominant males get all the respect, attraction, opportunities. But how do you be dominant actually? And how do you be a dominant man without being a jerk? So this idea of dominance is very tied to my entire personal growth journey. I grew up extremely timid, very shy, which of course means not dominant. Got bullied a lot when I was young. When I was in high school, a little bit older, I got robbed a lot. I got jumped many times in high school. And I know for sure a huge factor was the fact that I gave off this not dominant vibe. Like I was basically signaling that I'd be an easy target and essentially invited being victimized, being jumped a lot. So around this time, I started looking online for essentially how to be a confident man for various reasons. And this was pre-YouTube, and I stumbled across the dating advice forums that were prominent back then. And a lot of guys on there were speaking about dominance, but from a very abstract place, like why women are attracted to dominant men or why you need to be dominant in this dog-eat-dog world. And a lot of the advice basically came down to being a jerk. Like they had these so-called AMOG techniques where you were basically trying to out-alpha each other in this covert and like not kind way. And even though I understood the importance of this, I wanted to be dominant. Like this was such a foreign concept to me. I couldn't understand how or why, like it just didn't make sense. And some years later, I started working for a pretty well-known dating coach in this world. We would go to men's conferences together and he would introduce me to other dating coaches. And the question they would always ask is, oh, how's Rowan's game? Meaning, how was he with women? And as if listing off the stats of a video game character, my dating coach would say something like, oh yeah, he's pretty good at approaching, he's very good at banter, but he doesn't have a dominant bone in his body, which was a pretty accurate description of me. So I eventually switched gears. I went away from the male dating advice world and started taking classes and eventually working for this company called One Taste, which taught about sexuality from a female perspective. And their whole culture was very feminine and matriarchal. And there's many reasons why I started studying with them. But one of the big things, if I'm really honest, was that I wanted to be in a world where dominance wasn't important because it was so hard for me, right? In this matriarchal environment, it was all about empathy and connection, and being dominant was generally seen as a bad thing. So I thought like, okay, here's a place where I could really succeed. Here's an easier game, so to speak. Until I started working for them. I was hired as part of a team. It was myself and a bunch of young women. Like we were all in our 20s. I was the only guy on the team. And our employer, who was also my mentor, who was also a woman, slightly older than me, one day came up to me and said, you need to be more dominant. And I thought she was joking because this was not something that anyone spoke about in this culture. But she said, you're the only man here and you're not being dominant and all the women are crazy because of that. Like you need to learn how to top them. And something finally clicked. Like it hit me pretty hard actually to hear this from a woman, because it's one thing to read some guy on an internet forum speaking about like, oh yeah, guys need to be dominant, alpha males, whatever. But to hear this from a woman, to hear this specifically from a woman who taught about sexuality, taught intersexual dynamics, to hear from her that I needed to be more dominant in order to be a quote unquote good man, something finally got into me. And this led me to studying BDSM out of necessity. I really wanted to understand this topic of dominance. And obviously in the BDSM world, power is a big thing that's played with in a literal sense, in a hands-on sense. And in this practice, I started to understand from a tangible perspective of why and how a man should be dominant. And in these scenes where a woman was in this physically and emotionally vulnerable state, I realized that I really needed to learn how to access this part of myself. And when I did, I also recognized that even though I never thought of myself as a dominant guy, it was such a core part of my being that perhaps was just suppressed for whatever reason, that it was such a key virtue of masculinity. And nowadays, I'm in a different stage of life. I'm a family man, I'm a father. I was catching up with a friend from the BDSM world who asked me, how is it being a dad? And I said, it's a different kind of doming, right? Like to be an effective father, husband, member of your community, leader, obviously, a man has to access his dominance for the good of everyone. So in this episode, I'm going to share 3 key principles that I learned mainly in the BDSM world, but applied to normal life, to intimate, romantic relationships, family life, being a leader on a team, even informal social situations. Because if you pay attention, even in informal settings, there is some form of a dominance hierarchy. And if you understand these 3 key principles, you will understand how to be a dominant man in a way that people like. So this first principle I'm going to call direction of approval. Because when it comes to actual dominance, and specifically consensual dominance, where people want to follow a person or defer to a person or even submit to a person, they are actually choosing to, which is of course more sustainable than being a jerk, it has to do with attention and approval. Very simply, the most dominant person is the person whose approval is most valuable. So on the extreme low end, you can see a guy who's very low status. His approval doesn't matter. And actually, I remember in the early internet dating advice days, one of the pieces of advice I would see a lot is never give women compliments, right? It was seen as like a supplicating thing, or only needy guys give compliments. And yeah, that's true if you're low status, right? Like, the nebbish guy who has nothing to offer, who says, oh, you're so beautiful. Like, it comes off as creepy and weird, and it means nothing to a woman. If anything, she kind of feels uncomfortable by it. But those same exact words can be said by, think of your typical alpha guy, right? If that guy says it to a woman, it's incredibly valuable. Like, his approval, the fact that he would give her a compliment and pay attention to her, it matters so much. So the question is, how do you make your approval matter? One of the very basic functions of approval is that it's a way of offering connection with each other. So we all have some amount of approval. It's like almost like a currency we have, and we offer it to people, usually in exchange for their approval. And it's like a basic way of being friends, right? If I approve of you, if you approve of me, we're cool with each other, we're friends, we're on a team, we're a tribe, whatever, right? As with any currency, if it's over-circulated, it loses value. So someone who's giving away approval without any discernment, trying to validate everyone with the hope that they'll get a little bit of approval in return, his approval becomes very valueless. So you could think of the typical nice guy who's, being nice and supplicating and, super friendly to everyone, where there's something like inauthentic about it, right? Like, it's not like he actually likes all these people, is that he just wants people to like him back, as opposed to a person who doesn't give out approval very often. When he says something nice, you just assume it's more authentic. Like, he doesn't give it away for free. You must have earned it. So the basic tip here is to be discerning, to essentially be authentic, right? If you're giving away approval willy-nilly, then you're devaluing your currency. But this does not mean you should be disapproving on purpose, right? Like being an asshole or being judging, like always saying like, oh, this is stupid, that is stupid, being super judgmental, even though you're not giving away your approval, that doesn't necessarily make your approval valid. It just makes you someone no one wants to be around. Because the deeper principle here is, do you have an internal compass? Are you truly discerning? Do you have essentially a value system on what you like and don't like? And is it real? Because a dominant person has an internally driven compass. They have an internally driven value system. A less dominant person goes along with the value system of others, which brings us to a sub point, because this term I used, direction of approval, actually has a double meaning, right? Approval is a way that we offer connection to each other, but it's also a way that we get a cue on how to behave, especially in a group. Because the most primal way that we figure out what to do is through the approval of whoever we see as superior to us. So we all had this experience when we were little kids, right? All little kids want the approval of their parents. If they reward us for something, we want to do more of that. If they punish us for something, we want to steer away from that. Obviously, emotions can be complex, but in a very simple way, the approval of our parents or whoever we see as our guardian is a proxy for the outside world. A little kid doesn't know everything that's going on. They don't know how to feed themselves. They don't know what dangers are out there. But if the parent says, don't do that, or yeah, go that way, the child trusts that this is the right thing. Even if they're not consciously thinking it, that's the proxy for navigating life when they're a dependent. Which leads us into our second principle of handling the perimeter. So one of the more interesting experiences in the BDSM world is this phenomenon known as a subspace. Subspace is an altered state of consciousness that submissives, which are usually women, go into when they're really being handled well. It's this kind of enchanting experience where I've seen like a woman gets tied up and she goes into this altered state of euphoria where her body is hypersensitive and she can go deeper into her emotions, experience more pleasure. And actually, there have been quite a few studies that have shown this. Rutgers did a study a number of years ago where they showed that a woman can't go into full orgasm when she's by herself. Right? She can give herself an orgasm with a vibrator or whatever, but her amygdala, which is her fear center, will still be aware, will still be online, because if she's by herself, she has to have some awareness of her environment, right? Like, is the door locked? Is there going to be an intruder? And then obviously there's other, downstream thoughts like, did I leave the stove on, this and that? Like, if a woman is running those kinds of thoughts where some amount of her attention is out on the external world, that's less attention that's in on her body, which is why in these BDSM scenes, they're set up so that a woman can go deep into an internal experience. Her attention, her energy can be inward focus on her feelings, on what's going on within her, because the setting is set up that she either can't or is highly incentivized to not focus on the outside. Maybe she's blindfolded, maybe she's tied up, maybe she's, basically in a situation where she doesn't have control with a man who she trusts. A woman, and actually a person, can only go into this deep 100% inward focused state when they're in the presence of someone who they trust is handling the outside world, someone who's handling the metaphoric perimeter. Because one of the defining characteristics between dominant and submissive people is how they use their attention. Dominant people typically have their attention out. They're focused on the outside world. They're interpreting reality for themselves. They're making their own decisions, where more submissive or less dominant people tend to be more self-conscious, right? Their focus is on themselves, like, do other people like me? Am I doing things the right way? Where a truly dominant person doesn't think about that at all. They're just focused on the outside world. So the simple takeaway here is, if you want to be more dominant, put more of your attention outwards. And this is actually why my masculine archetype challenge, most of the exercises are strongly focused on noticing and modifying how you use your attention moment to moment and day to day. Dominant people tend to have their attention out, which is literally the opposite of being self-conscious. So for a woman or for anyone to choose and to willingly go into that more inward focused present state, which is a gift, it's a beautiful experience to have, they have to trust that someone else is handling the outside world. Someone else is handling that perimeter. And there's two aspects to the perimeter. There's the material perimeter, which is like literal survival, literal protecting and providing, and the spiritual perimeter, which is more the feeling or the perceptions associated with that. So in modern day-to-day life, the material perimeter isn't as important, right? If you live in developed society, I assume you're not experiencing threats to your survival on a regular basis, but it is important on an underlying level, and many of our more primal activities, such as attraction, are still related to it, right? This is why, even though muscles don't really matter for most people in modern day, women are still attracted to guys who are bigger than them, taller than them, physically strong. I'm not a big guy, but one of the first things my wife said to me when we started dating was that she was so attracted to the realization that I could kill her whenever I want. And I was like, okay, that's an interesting way to put it. But I understood what she meant, of course. It meant that she doesn't have to worry about our security. She doesn't have to worry if the door is locked anymore because she's with a guy who can handle that stuff better than her. But what actually matters day to day more is what I'm calling the spiritual perimeter. So our feelings, our perceptions, which are usually a proxy for the material stuff. When I'm coaching men in relationships, one of the key questions is often, does she accept your version of reality? Right? Does she trust your perceptions? Because if she doesn't trust your perceptions, she's not going to trust your decision making, which means she's not actually letting you hold the perimeter, right? She's trying to make those external decisions herself. Her attention is still externally focused to some degree on the outside world because she doesn't trust that you can handle it better than her. So I saw this during the pandemic a lot, where I was receiving a lot of requests for coaching from married couples where maybe they got along great, they'd been married for a while, they generally agreed on things, but when the pandemic occurred and there were conflicting narratives on what to believe, a lot of couples experienced conflict where if they subscribed to different narratives, that they had different perceptions. And obviously this in itself can lead to a lot of fighting. A lot of people fought over belief systems during this period. But in a marriage, it's particularly significant because what often was experienced was that the man realized for the first time that his wife wasn't actually in his perimeter. Even if he didn't use that language, it's like she was choosing to believe what's on the TV and ridicule her husband more than at least listening to his perceptions, which means she probably never really trusted him. And the thing is, you could have a seemingly cordial and happy relationship or marriage for many years, so long as there's no moment where like an aligned decision has to be made or there's a crisis or an emergency. Everything can seem fine. Usually these relationships end up taking like a roommate kind of vibe, but everything can seem fine until one of these moments where you realize that to be really interdependent, you need to have this kind of dynamic. It's not that the man's way always has to go, but actually, as in BDSM, it is a gift the dom gives the sub or the dependent, where she doesn't have to focus on the outside world and she can focus on more internal things, which of course is evolutionary driven by pregnancy, right? A woman has to be very inwardly focused when she's pregnant. Therefore, she looks for a man who she can depend on in those serious moments. So if you want to be the dominant one in a relationship or a family or a team, group, whatever, you need to show that your perimeter, specifically your spiritual perimeter, is one worth relaxing into. It's kind of like, the metaphoric nest of a man, right? You're building this reality, you're building these perceptions, and she, if it's a woman, can choose to enter it and relax into it because she trusts that you're handling the outside world. Which means, again, having a clear value system, having a clear vision, having discernment of reality, being decisive, being certain of what you believe and what you do in certain situations, right? Like if you're uncertain and you're constantly second guessing and waffling and you don't trust your own decision making, there's no way she or any dependent will trust your decision making. Like no one wants to follow a leader who's very unsure of himself. And it also means that your perimeter is actually a happier place to be, right? Like, is there happiness and laughter and joy in your home, in your relationship? I mean, this is part of why men making women laugh is part of the mating ritual, if you will. You know, Christopher Hitchens had that article. It's titled Why Women Aren't Funny, but it's not really about women not being funny. Of course they're funny. It's that women have to see men as funny in order for them to mate. She has to be able to derive joy from his attempts at humor. Otherwise, why should she settle into his perimeter? But probably the biggest takeaway from this perimeter idea, I'm getting directly from my friend Omer Pani, I'm quoting him, is that a dominant person has to take 200% responsibility. So in a BDSM scene, the sub is putting herself in an extremely physically vulnerable and emotionally vulnerable situation. So she can't fully be, she can be responsible for her own internal experience as much as she can. But if she's tied up and hanging from the ceiling or whatever it is you're doing, the man, the dom, needs to be responsible for it too. He needs to be responsible for his own experience, but also fully responsible for her experience. Like if something goes wrong, if she gets hurt, if she even has a bad time, it's on him. And you can extrapolate this idea into any kind of relationship, into leadership. It's actually directly related to Jocko Willink's idea of extreme ownership. It's that if you're the leader, if you're the dom, so to speak, if you want others to truly choose to depend on you, you can't blame anyone, right? The buck has to stop with you, right? So if you ever find yourself resenting or blaming or complaining, even in your head, you're actually making yourself less dominant, because true dominant people, the people that others want to depend on, they don't make excuses. They can't possibly blame others, because when you're blaming somewhere else, you're saying they have power over you. Whereas a true dominant person, a true alpha, so to speak, it's between them and reality, right? Like there's no surrogates, there's no other people to pass responsibility onto. You're taking 200% responsibility, or if you have a whole family, maybe it's 300% or 400%, right? There's no one you're going to pass on responsibility to because you are at the top of the hierarchy. Which brings us to our third and final principle. In the wild, dominance is earned through real physical challenge. This could be, males competing to see who's going to be the alpha and therefore get the mating opportunities. It could be the dominant male defending his tribe or his family from external invaders or predators or whatever. Like there are real challenges in nature, outside of developed civilization, where dominance is earned. So even though in modern day life, we don't normally have threats to our survival on a regular basis, basically anytime you experience a stress response, whether it's in conflict or whether, you get nervous speaking in front of a group, or something maybe pretty close to replication or a mating opportunity, speaking to an attractive stranger, you have, any kind of visceral rush, whether it's dopamine, testosterone, or the stress hormone cortisol, your body is seeing that as an archetypal moment, and that's actually an opportunity. Dominant people seek out this experience. They initiate the stress response. As my friend Brian Bejin from Fearless Man always says, they step into tension, as opposed to submissive people who shy away from the tension, or they hope someone else will deal with it for them. Essentially, are you willing to do the hard things so that the people who would depend on you or defer to you or follow you don't have to as much? And this even relates to sexuality. Like I mentioned earlier, how I started studying sexuality because I had psychogenic ED. And something I learned and something I recommend to all guys experiencing this kind of thing is that you have to initiate. It seems counterintuitive because a lot of guys, if they're nervous about getting it up or disappointing their partner, or whatever the situation is, they might feel passive around sexuality because they're so nervous. But often if a guy's having this recurring psychological problem, it's because he's being too passive. It's because he's not initiating based on desire. He's not taking that risk or stepping into tension, and his body won't respond that way. Like men actually get a visceral rush when they put themselves out there. Because basically, and this is essentially a life principle for any man, is that when you see something that has to be done or is beneficial to be done and it's difficult, that specifically is the most important thing you have to do. And not just for whatever material reasons, but if there's something important for you to do and you're shying away from it because of emotional discomfort, you're actually harming your internal well-being. When we put off important things or shy away from conflict or any of these things, we feel shitty about it, and it might actually be a loser effect. Your testosterone and dopamine levels might actually be dropping. Your cortisol levels might be responding because your body thinks you just got your butt kicked. And obviously looking for fights or having a chip on your shoulder is not a dominant behavior. Even if you're winning your fights or whatever, no one's going to want to be around you. So you might be the most dominant person in a hierarchy of one, which is meaningless. But is when things come up, you have to deal with them. So I actually had an experience recently where I hired this company to do some work for me. I wasn't happy with their work at all, so I told them to stop doing work and basically refund my money. I ended up on a Zoom call with one of their managers who was clearly there to convince me to not get my money back, to basically tell me that that's not the policy and I couldn't get my money. And this was, he was a nice enough guy. He wasn't a jerk or anything, but this was a clear zero-sum competition where I wanted my money back and he didn't want to give it to me. And the way I got my money back wasn't by being a jerk. He wasn't a jerk either. It wasn't by doing anything manipulative, but I had to show him that I could handle more tension than him. Right? Like I was the dominant one in this call. And it was simply through basically being willing to step deeper and deeper into tension than he was willing to go, because I knew, of course, that, he could refund me by just, clicking one button on Stripe, right? It was really just, a psychological game. And by showing him that I could handle more tension than him, essentially I dominated him, but in a nice way, right? We were fairly cordial, but I could see that he couldn't handle the tension as much as me. And eventually he said, okay, yeah, we'll give you your money back. And my point wasn't to be a jerk to him or to, dunk on him or anything like that. I just wanted my money back, right? But I could see in his face he was experiencing the loser effect because he knew that he got topped, right? He got alphaed. And of course, the point of this is not to be some tough guy going around alphaing people, but real dominance, consensual dominance, the kind of dominance where people want to defer to you and follow you and be in your presence and be in your perimeter is a very pro-social, and I would say the pro-social aspect of masculinity. You are creating that perimeter, that metaphorical nest where your dependents can relax within. It is a gift that you give people by being dominant without being a jerk. So if you understand these things, how approval and attention work, the perimeter, stepping into tension in the right way, you will be a more dominant person that people will naturally want to respect, will be attracted to, will want to be your friend, give you opportunities, and basically all the benefits that come with being higher status.